Our first topic tonight is Debunking the Jesus Seminar. What do you know about the Jesus Seminar? Anyone heard anything about it? Green shirt in the back. It's materialist. I guess, yeah, depending on what you mean by that, sure.
They go through different verses of Scripture and color code them to determine in their minds which are the authentic sayings of Jesus and which are not.
Do you have the 5 Gospels?
No, I don't.
You must have seen it. Yes, that's true. We're going to talk about that. Their version of the New Testament, color-coded New Testament. Anyone else heard of anything regarding the Jesus Seminar or major figures? Dominic Crossan. Dum, dum, dum. Dominic Crossan. Yeah, we'll talk about him uncomfortably. Anything else? Okay. So the Jesus Seminar. Materialism. You're probably talking about the next talk. We're going to be talking about the prosperity gospel. Okay. All right. The Jesus Seminar. The Jesus Seminar was a group founded by the biblical scholar Robert Funk in 1985. From 1985, the group held meetings, published journals, books, and through its more public members, made regular television appearances. Dominic Crossan is that figure. Until the death of its founder, Robert Funk, in 2005, when it, shortly thereafter, unofficially disbanded. The Jesus Seminar, though no longer officially meeting, still has much influence today. Not so much among serious biblical scholars steeped in current research, but surely among the general public through its past publications, most significantly the books titled The 5 Gospels, 1993, and then The Acts of Jesus, published in 1998. The stated mission of the Jesus Seminar was to educate the public about the historical findings of the scholarly world concerning Jesus. They rested their research on what they described as 7 scholarly pillars. First, the distinction between the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith, an idea that had begun in post-Enlightenment German Protestant biblical scholarship in the early 1700s. The distinction between, as they say, the synoptic Jesus and the Johannine Jesus, with a significant favoritism for what they thought was more historically accurate in the former, that is, the synoptic Jesus. Number 3, a heavier reliance on the Markan Jesus among the synoptics, which they saw as the most reliable and earliest of the gospel portraits of the historical Jesus in the 4 Gospels. Number 4, the reliance on the hypothetical source Q, whose existence began to be proposed in the late 1800s, again among post-Enlightenment German Protestant biblical scholars. Are we starting to see a pattern? Before we get too ahead of ourselves and move on to the 5th pillar, does anyone know what the document, or the hypothetical document Q is, or the two-source hypothesis, or Markan priority? Thomas?
The idea was there was a basic story that was drawn for Mark or Luke and Matthew, except that they all used different bits. It was most common in Mark, that is, you can find most of this Q document in Mark, but it was some other thing which included something that was lost along the way.
Right, good, very good. Can we pull up the diagram and I'll explain what Thomas was just saying. So the two-source hypothesis is basically, as you see on the diagram, does this have to do with how close I am to the little... Oh, okay. So you have Mark's gospel here. and the Q document. Has anyone ever seen the Q document? No. Neither has anyone else. So the Q document, it's called Q because this is the first letter of the German word Quelle. Quelle for source. So it's abbreviated, source from the German Quelle, Q. The Q document. It's a hypothetical source. It doesn't exist, as far as we can discern. But there were German scholars who suggested its existence to support what they called Markan priority. That is, that the Gospel of Mark, among the three synoptic Gospels, was the first written. But there was a problem, because there were things that were in both Matthew and Luke. And if Matthew and Luke drew from Mark, but there were things common in Matthew and Luke that did not appear in Mark, then they must be drawing from another source, Quelle, another source, which no longer existed apparently. So this is called the two-source hypothesis. It's a product of post-Enlightenment German biblical scholarship. It also has to do with a lot of the anti-Semitism in Germany at the time and the culture conf, but that would take us too far afield. So this is one of the answers for what's called the synoptic problem. The problem of, or the question, what is the relationship of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic Gospels? They are very similar. They can be seen, you can lay them out on one page in what's called a synopsis and look at them in columns, but there are differences. And so as early as Origen, there were questions about what is the relationship of these three. The earliest discussions of this and answers for this problem we find in Eusebius and Augustine and other fathers of the time, who explained that Matthew was written first for a Palestinian Christian audience. Mark's gospel was the record of Peter's preaching by Mark, the evangelist, while Peter was in Rome. And Luke's gospel is the product of his research of the local sources, as he says in the beginning of his gospel, and his travels with Paul. As you know, Luke was a companion of Paul. The early church had an answer for what became known as the synoptic problem, but in post-Enlightenment German Protestant scholarship, they weren't too interested in reading the Fathers. They could have saved some time had they done that. The fifth pillar of their research. So again, just to clarify, that fourth pillar was the reliance on the hypothetical Q document. How do you know what is the Q document? Well, if you find information that is in Matthew, a passage that's in Matthew, that is also in Luke, but is not in Mark, then, as the theory goes, it must be coming from Q. And so you can reconstruct the hypothetical document based upon that commonality between Matthew and Luke, but difference from Mark. Do you see how it works? Now, of course, you can rearrange these squares all sorts of different ways and throw Q out the window, and you can come up with all sorts of other answers, right? All right, so now, the fifth pillar, the denial that Jesus had any interest in eschatology. These are the 7 pillars from which they worked. The denial that Jesus had any interest in eschatology, the members of the seminar determined that the idea that Jesus was interested in eschatology, that is, the end times, the end things, the things having to do with the end of the world, was contrary to the historical Jesus that they imagined. And so therefore, when they looked into the Scriptures, if they saw something having to do with Jesus speaking about the end, any kind of eschatological discourse, that must be inauthentic. Can be discounted. Number 6, the idea that since Jesus existed in an oral culture, and not a print culture, primarily at least, then only those sayings that were short and memorable would have been preserved and written down with any accuracy. For example, concerning Luke chapters 22, 36 through 37, we can turn there and take a look at one of the types of passages which they discounted. Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22, verse 36. He said to them, "But now let him who has a purse take it, and likewise a bag. And let him who has no sword sell his mantle, and buy one. For I tell you that this scripture must be fulfilled in me." And he was reckoned with transgressors. For what is written about me has its fulfillment. There is nothing in these words, according to the members, in these words attributed to Jesus, that cuts against the social grain, that would surprise or shock his friends, or that reflects exaggeration, humor, or paradox, and thus would not have been memorable. And thus is simply a fabrication of the early church. Number 7, the seventh pillar. The assumption that the information about Jesus in the four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is historically unreliable. So they begin with that assumption that when you look at the four Gospels, the first thing you assume is what you're reading is historically unreliable until proven innocent. Right? Along with these 7 pillars, the members of the seminar also worked from certain criteria in their examination of the particular passages of the Gospels. Criteria for authenticity. Multiple attestation. For example, Jesus' mother was named Mary. This appears in all 4 Gospels. All 4 Gospels say that Jesus had a mother and her name was Mary. That's multiple attestation. If a particular saying of Jesus or an act of Jesus appears in multiple Gospels, it would be considered more likely to be historically reliable, at least as a relic of some sort of event or saying. If it appears only in, say, one Gospel, then it is most likely the fabrication of that particular author. These are criteria for authenticity. Second, embarrassment. So, for example, the crucifixion, which has multiple attestation and is considered embarrassing. You have the disciples of Jesus, his followers, would not have created a story so embarrassing as that their founder was crucified in a horrible death by the Roman Empire. That would be considered embarrassing, not something that you would likely fabricate if you were creating a new religion. So, therefore, the crucifixion story, with multiple attestation and being an embarrassment to the early church, is most likely historically relevant. The third criterion for authenticity, a saying of Jesus. Those were acts of Jesus in the second one there. But now a saying of Jesus, irony, frustration, reversal, opposite of expectation. If you see in the saying, and we already talked about this in one of the pillars, if you see in the saying of Jesus something that is the opposite of what the audience would have expected, it's shocking. Love your enemies. Well, this is something that they most likely would have been able to remember because it's shocking. It's not simple and plain. And so therefore, since it's in the text and it's shocking, it then is possibly something that was remembered by the authors or the friends of Jesus, those who had contact with him. Again, to explain what that means, if Jesus had said something very simple, then who would remember it? And so therefore, if something is simple in the New Testament, some saying of Jesus, then it's probably a fabrication, because who would have remembered such a simple statement? You see how the argument goes. Fourth, trust in God. This is one of the more shocking ones. Trust in God. If a statement of Jesus or an act of Jesus implies trust in God, it's most likely authentic. The members of the seminar, for some reason, determined that the historical Jesus had great trust in God, and he taught others to have trust in God. And so therefore, whatever we find in the Gospels that in any way hints at that must be authentic. You getting dizzy on that one? For example, ask and it will be given to you. Ask and it will be given to you. Knock and it will be opened. Now, criteria for inauthenticity. Criteria for inauthenticity. A self-reference by Jesus. I am the light of the world. Inauthentic. The members of the seminar imagined a historical Jesus who would not have directed attention to himself. He was a very humble, wise, wandering Jew, and this was just not the type of thing you would have imagined of him. So if he said something like, I am the Messiah, I am the Son of Man, I am the light of the world, this is a fabrication of the early church, the members of the seminar determined. Second criterion for inauthenticity, framing materials. If you find a saying of Jesus, love your enemies, which is shocking and may be an authentic saying, the narrative that surrounds it is most likely a fabrication of the author framing this relic, this historical relic about Jesus. So Jesus says, love your enemies. Well, before this, it says Jesus went up on a mountain. Well, that's the creation and the imagination of the author. Then after that, Jesus went down the mountain. That's a frame and device, a narrative that is created to couch a little relic, a jewel of one of Jesus' original sayings. The third criterion for inauthenticity, community issues. If Jesus says something that has to do with the early church, his movement that he was starting, apparently, then it is most likely inauthentic. For example, telling Simon that he is the rock upon which he's going to build this church. Or saying, if there is a problem in the community, take it to the church. This is in Matthew's Gospel. Or at the end of Matthew's Gospel, go out and make disciples of all nations. The members of the seminar had determined that Jesus had no interest in forming any kind of a movement. And so therefore, as you look into the New Testament and you find Jesus preparing his disciples for anything after his life, would be considered inauthentic. Anything preparing for the structure and the longevity of the community, the movement he was creating. Jesus didn't call disciples, according to the members of the seminar. They just happened to follow along. The fourth and final criterion for inauthenticity, theological agenda of a particular author. If you're looking at a saying or an act of Jesus in one of the four Gospels, and it in some way fits or supports the theological agenda, the purpose of writing of that author, then it is most likely a fabrication of that particular author. They would combine this with multiple attestation as well. With these criteria, authentic and inauthentic, and the 7 pillars already mentioned, the seminar members set to work, combing the 4 Gospels, along with anything else they thought relevant from the period, such as the non-canonical Gospel of Thomas, looking for literary relics buried in the ash heap of theological embellishment. These were their presuppositions. But how did they actually do the digging? What were their tools? Does anybody know? I think somebody said it earlier. Colored beads. That's right, the beads, the beads. Each member of the seminar was given a pile of beads, red, pink, gray, and black. Red symbolized an authentic statement of Jesus, historically accurate statement or act of Jesus. It represented 3 points. Pink, probably authentic, but not for sure. 2 points. Gray, probably inauthentic. 1 point. And then black, inauthentic, 0 points. When a particular passage was up for a vote of authenticity, each scholar placed a bead of his or her choosing into a common container. Based upon the consensus of the members, determined by voting with beads, the historical Jesus looked like this. Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great. He was a child of a woman named Mary, possibly the son of a man named Joseph, but likely illegitimate. He was born in Nazareth, not Bethlehem. He spent his adult life as a wandering wisdom teacher. His primary concern was for the poor and outcasts. He became a public nuisance, was arrested in Jerusalem, and crucified by the Romans. That is what the seminar determined was historically accurate in the New Testament about Jesus. Also some insertions on their own, of course. Everything else in the New Testament about Jesus is the Christ of faith. Remember that distinction, the historical Jesus versus the Christ of faith. The Christ of faith is the product of the theological embellishments of the early church. Jesus did not perform miracles, did not claim to be the Messiah, and surely did not rise from the dead. Now, let's turn to a few video clips taken from an ABC show by Peter Jennings in 2000 titled In Search of Jesus. Robert Funk, the founder of the Jesus Seminar. Again, Robert Funk, 1985, founded the Jesus Seminar. Co-founder, Dominic Crossan. Here we hear in this interview with Peter Jennings in the year 2000, ABC, we hear him discussing the virgin birth.
Legitimate, and the story was a cover-up.
That's not. But that first character there, that was Robert Funk, the founder of the Jesus Seminar, and also biblical scholar, did a lot of good work in some other areas of biblical studies. Here, of course, was not his shining trophy. The next video clip we're going to be looking at is Dominic Crossan, who was in many ways the co-founder with Robert Funk of the Jesus Seminar. Here, based upon the criterion of multiple attestation, remember appearing in multiple Gospels, Here he's denying the institution of the Eucharist.
Historians differ about what happened at the Last Supper. Some people think the whole speech about his body and blood at that meal was added by the Gospel writers.
It doesn't happen in the Gospel of John, for example. And you wonder, why on earth does this not happen in John? Did he forget it, as it were? And if it was so important, how can he leave it out?
Okay, that's Dominic Crossan, unfortunately a former Catholic priest. His dissertation was on the resurrection of Jesus, denying the resurrection of Jesus, that his body was, rather than put in a tomb, his body was eaten by dogs and vultures. If you're feeling uncomfortable about that, you'll be even more uncomfortable when you find that that dissertation was given and passed in a pontifical university in Rome. Number 3. This third one we're going to be looking at is Marcus Borg. Marcus Borg, who died just this year, was one of the more well-known members of the Jesus Seminar, made a number of public appearances like Dominic Crossan. Here we see him denying the salvific nature of Jesus' death.
If we don't understand why he could be executed, then we miss the If we don't understand why he could be executed, then we miss the political passion that animated his mission. In a sense, he gave his life for the least of these. And when we turn the story of Jesus instead into the eternal sacrifice for sin that makes our forgiveness possible, then we really set aside that which mattered so much to him, namely the poor, the untouchables, the suffering of people.
I remember seeing him in a debate with another biblical scholar that I'll be mentioning to you, N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright is a very conservative Anglican biblical scholar, probably one of the top 5 in the world. And I remember watching a debate with him, he and Marcus Borg. Marcus Borg is an Episcopalian. N.T. Wright was an Anglican, so that added some interest to the debate. And they were debating at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. when I was doing my doctoral work at Catholic University. So the whole Biblical Studies department went over there to watch this. We were all sitting on N.T. Wright's side, of course. So I'll mention to you N.T. Wright again. I'll give you some resources from him. So this fourth one we're going to be looking at, this fourth and final clip, is Dominic Crossan, the former Catholic priest who is actually still alive. Dominic Crossan, who was, as I said, basically the co-founder, along with Robert Funk, of the Jesus Seminar, and in many ways the public image of the Jesus Seminar. He made a number of public appearances. When I asked, does anybody know about the Jesus Seminar, you remember at the beginning, the only name that came up was Dominic Crossan, right? So he's a very popular author. He's written lots of books, given lots of lectures around the world, and he's well known in the scholarly world and also in the popular theological world. He first did his work after his dissertation in the parables of Jesus and was considered to be a pretty good scholar in that area. Once he got involved in the Jesus Seminar, he became somewhat of a joke in biblical studies and lost a lot of his credibility. So this fourth clip we're going to be looking at is Dominic Crossan, co-founder with Robert Funk of the Jesus Seminar, denying the resurrection, his area of expertise.
3 days later, according to the Gospels, the women come to the tomb and find it empty. Jesus then begins appearing to his friends, and suddenly they come out of hiding, proclaiming that he is risen from the dead, resurrected. We asked so many people what they thought about resurrection. There's a wide range of opinion.
The first question is even more basic. Was Jesus buried at all? Roman crucifixion, the purpose of crucifixion was state terrorism, and the function was to leave the body on the cross for the carrion crows and the prowling dogs. It was not simply that made you suffer a lot, it meant that you didn't get buried. That's what made it one of the supreme Roman penalties, lack of burial. As I read those stories, I feel terribly sympathetic for the followers of Jesus because I hear hope there, not history.
Okay, so that's the Jesus seminar. Now for a few criticisms. We'll close with this. It seems hardly necessary to talk about criticisms of the Jesus seminar among a crowd such as this, the problems being obvious enough from what you just saw and heard, but let's take a moment and look critically at the critical scholarship of the seminar. By the way, what I'm saying here are not my own words, but a summary of the major critiques of well-known major biblical scholars in the world, such as Luke Timothy Johnson, Richard Hayes, Ben Witherington, and N.T. Wright. These are some of the top scholars in biblical studies right now. Qualifications of the members, first of all. Well, 14 of the 74 members of the seminar who contributed to the first book, the 5 Gospels, that's 14 of 74, were considered well-respected biblical scholars. Dominic Crossan, Marcus Borg, Robert Funk, and a few others. Many were relatively unknown in the scholarly world, and some weren't even biblical scholars at all. One of the funnier examples is one of the members who was a film director and had a mathematics degree, master's degree in mathematics and physics. He was one of the members who was voting with the beads. It's hard to call the seminar a legitimate sample of scholarly opinion in biblical studies, especially when such major scholarly critique of the seminar has come from such major scholars as Ed Sanders, N.T. Wright, Luke Timothy Johnson, the list goes on. As N.T. Wright put in comparison to the members of the Jesus seminar, quote, "Another figure whose work has been totally ignored is Ben F. Meyer, the Catholic scholar, who has more understanding of how ancient texts work in his little finger than any member of the Jesus seminar seems to have in their entire word processor, and whose writings on Jesus is utterly rigorous, utterly scholarly, and utterly different in its results from anything in the Jesus seminar publication, The 5 Gospels." That's N.T. Wright, speaking of on his most favorite author, Ben Meyer. If you ever have a chance to read his book, Aims of Jesus, it's a wonderful read. Second major critique. The portrait of Jesus drawn by the Jesus seminar looks much like the portrait of Jesus drawn by Robert Funk, Dominic Crossan, and Marcus Borg before any voting ever took place. And it in fact reflects the theological views of the major members more than any kind of scientific, unbiased analysis. Hard to call voting with beads scientific. This reminds me of the now classic saying of George Tyrrell of 1909 in his critique of the historical Jesus research of an earlier historical Jesus scholar, Harnack. He said, "The Christ that Harnack sees, looking back through the 19 centuries of Catholic darkness, is only the reflection of a liberal Protestant face seen at the bottom of a deep well." One could apply this saying in the present case. The historical Jesus that the seminar sees through the lens of their own theological bias is only the reflection of their own face, seen at the bottom of a deep well. Though in this case, the image is not on the surface of water, but a bucket filled with colored beads. The rejection of the possibility that Jesus made eschatological statements. This assumption. This is contrary to all current biblical research that would confirm, as the last 2,000 years of tradition have, that Jesus was concerned with eschatological issues. Eschatological, that is, things having to do with the end times. So another major critique is that the portrait of Jesus that has been created by the Jesus seminar in this respect, along with many others, is completely contrary to what has been found in scientific research today and also in the history of the tradition of the church. Fourth, divorcing Jesus from his cultural milieu. The portrait of Jesus drawn by the seminar looks nothing like any of his contemporaries in his culture and historical period. Jesus' contemporaries were interested in theological and eschatological issues. Look at the Essenes, the Pharisees, John the Baptist, the Sadducees. 5, the bias against canonical sources and a preference for non-canonical sources, such as the Gospel of Thomas, and hypothetical sources such as Q and even Proto-Mark, an early form of Mark which was more palatable to the Jesus Seminar, a hypothetical source again. And even a doubly hypothetical source, Proto-Q. Q was a nice document for the German scholars in the post-Enlightenment period, but it made the Jesus Seminar uncomfortable in this reconstructed document because in Q, this hypothetical document, determined by looking at passages in Matthew and Luke, Jesus apparently spoke about eschatological issues. Therefore, there was most likely a proto-Q before these eschatological additions were made. If the Jesus Seminar is correct on the historical accuracy of these sources and the existence of the hypothetical ones, then the early church radically changed the details about Jesus that they knew and successfully eliminated any memory or literary relic of the previously known historical details. To quote one scholarly critique, the conclusions of the Jesus Seminar, quote, requires the assumption that someone about a generation removed from the events in question radically transformed the authentic information about Jesus that was circulating at that time, superimposed a body of material 4 times as large, fabricated almost entirely out of whole cloth, while the church suffered sufficient collective amnesia to accept the transformation as legitimate. So, that's the Jesus Seminar. Kind of a depressing topic. But here's some good news. And we'll talk about some more good news in the next session. There are major biblical scholars out there who have opposed the works of the Jesus Seminar. N.T. Wright is a classic example of someone who has, for the most part, devoted his life of scholarship to counter the arguments of the Jesus Seminar. He's an Anglican scholar, incredible biblical scholar, one of the most Catholic biblical scholars I've ever read, strangely enough. N.T. Wright, if you want to read a little more by him, aside from the quotes I gave you, he has an article analyzing the publication of the Jesus Seminar of the 5 Gospels. This is N.T. Wright. His article is titled, 5 Gospels but No Gospel. Jesus and the Seminar. Jesus and the Seminar. This was in the book Authenticating the Activities of Jesus. Authenticating the Activities of Jesus, published in 1999. Maybe something more accessible to you than an article like that would be one of his books. N.T. Wright has written a number of scholarly texts, also popular works. I highly recommend them to you. N.T. Wright's book, where he, as a major counter to the Jesus Seminar, is Jesus and the Victory of God. Jesus and the Victory of God. If you have any issues with insomnia, this, along with some melatonin, will surely help you. It's a great work if you're really into this stuff, okay? But for most people, it's too much. It's written for doctoral level studies, and it's a big, thick book. It's about that thick, okay? So, but if you really want to get into it, N.T. Wright, Jesus and the Victory of God, would be his most substantial work countering the work of the Jesus Seminar. And then, regarding the synoptic problem, if you were interested in what we talked about, that Q and the two-source theory, and where did that come from? And it sounds kind of crazy. It is. And many biblical scholars are rejecting it today, thank God. But there are a number of great works that have been done recently countering that theory that came out of post-Enlightenment Germany, but has had so much influence on scholars today. The major scholars who have done work against that theory: Bernard Orchard, a Catholic biblical scholar of the 50s. Bernard Orchard, none of his works are still in print, unfortunately. William Farmer, who was a Methodist scholar and eventually became a Catholic and taught at Dallas University. He passed away a few years ago, but many of his works are still in print. Anything by William Farmer is against the two-source hypothesis, anything he wrote. And then his most important disciple or student, David Dungan. David Dungan, D-U-N-G-A-N, wrote the definitive work on the history of the synoptic problem. That's the title, The History of the Synoptic Problem. He traces the question from origin until today. Very well done, work, very scholarly, and very well received, even by those who disagree with Dungan and Farmer, those who still hold to Markan priority. But a good work if you're interested in that question. If you know anybody who, for one reason or another, talks about Q and Markan priority to you, this is the book to give them. Okay? All right. Now, this was a bit of a dry subject. Our next session after the break is on the prosperity gospel and the word faith movement. Benny Hinn, Kenneth Copeland, the televangelists, and all of that. We've got some exciting clips for you to watch in the next session. So we'll see you in...
We'll take just about maybe a 7-minute break, I think, 6 to 7 minute break, and stretch your legs, use the restroom. We'll